Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Shelley Reed. I am the manager of the Legal Services National Technology Assistance Project. I am a middle-aged white woman with brown hair, glasses, and a peach-colored shirt on today. We're here today with Rose Devlin and Emily Johnson from Theory and Principle, and I'm going to turn it over to them to give us all the information about user experience. Emily and Rose?
Hi there. My name is Rose Devlin. I'm currently the lead UX UI designer at Theory and Principle. I've been a designer for about 15 years, starting my career as a graphic designer in San Francisco and then moving on to user experience about 10 years ago. I've designed products ranging from e-commerce sites to healthcare products to applications in the justice space. So for the past kind of 5 years, I've been focused on legal design and working with access to justice here at Theory and Principle. So Theory and Principle is a product design and development firm for the legal industry. We work with clients globally to build digital products and improve the legal experience for all. Our clients are typically law firms, nonprofits, and legal tech companies. I'll hand it over to my colleague, Emily Johnson.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm Emily Johnson. I'm a UI UX designer at Theory and Principle, and I've been with Theory and Principle for a couple years now. So worked with a lot of different legal projects spanning law firms, access to justice, like Rose mentioned, and a lot of new AI projects as that's been growing in the last year or so. And prior, I was working on kind of similar consulting kind of work, but just with larger enterprise scale companies. So more lately, just been focusing on this legal industry. And we're excited to talk to you guys today about UX research for legal. So without further ado, I think we can go ahead and get started. So we're going to talk about several things today. First, we'll start with an introduction of UX and UI, kind of just generally getting into the topic and why they're important. And then we'll talk about research as it pertains to product design and kind of talking about the value of that as a project. We'll talk about several different types of research that you can run and sort of the pros and cons of each. And then we'll talk about once you've done some form of research and you've gathered some data, how to start making sense of it. And then we'll finish off with a few case studies of real projects that we've worked on at Theory and Principle.
Okay, so as Emily mentioned, we're going to start with an understanding of the user-centered design process. So let's get the words down first. User experience, UX, is often used interchangeably with user interface, UI. They are both important parts of the design process. UX refers to the way a user interacts with an application. In digital design, UX covers a user's overall experience as they move through a product or a website. So to understand that, let's take an example of a UX change. This is the homepage for Airbnb. This is how it was a couple years ago. It was simply a search bar where the user came in and typed in a destination. They recently redesigned it to include, in addition to destinations, they included categories. Categories like tree houses, countryside, barns, islands, etc. So this was done based on user research around how people travel. So after the pandemic, they found that a lot of people weren't working in offices anymore and wanted to travel based on experiences rather than just a geographic location. So as you can see, the UI, what it looks like, the fonts and everything stayed the same, but the experience was different. User interface is referring to layout, colors, typography, and how something looks. We'll take a look at a UX change here, which is from Google. These are how Google's icons used to look. They used drop shadows, muted colors, and the icons kind of mimicked real life objects like the envelope or the calendar. They were recently redesigned. In this new design, you can see that the icons have been updated. The colors are less mute, they're brighter, they're more abstract, and the drop shadows are gone. The new design definitely feels like a cohesive and consistent set of icons. However, some may feel that they are actually too similar to each other and hard to differentiate. So in this case, the UI has been updated, but it also may impact the user experience. So how do we evaluate good UX? Here are some of the best UX practices we follow at Theory and Principle. So visibility of system status means keeping the user informed about what's going on. Audience and tone of voice is especially important in legal. The design should utilize plain language that the user will understand. User control and freedom means letting the user make mistakes and undo when necessary. Jacob's law means don't reinvent the wheel, basically. Most people spend most of their time on other websites, not yours, so they expect yours to work the same as other websites. And prioritization. This is our most common problem when working with lawyers. Lawyers often feel the need, rightfully, to explain everything to their clients. But within the design community, we have a saying, if everything is important, nothing is important. Help and documentation. Lastly, the main thing you need to know about this is that nobody is going to read your instructions. Well, at least not before making multiple mistakes and trying to muddle through your website. Available documentation should be timely and specific to the user's goal. So I'm not going to go into depth on all of these best practices, but I do have a few examples. So for visibility of system status, basically the design should keep users informed about what's going on. In this example, if you're uploading a document, you should let the user know what's happening, the progress. And then once it's uploaded, a check mark indicates that it was successfully uploaded. The design should speak the user's language. So this is referring to audience and tone of voice. This is an example of an app that we designed. It utilizes plain language. And when we need to explain something in more detail to the user, we might use a tooltip. For example, here we say, what is a legal advocate? And that gives more information if that is needed. Users often perform actions by mistake and need a clearly marked emergency exit. So this is about user control and freedom. If somebody is deleting something or removing it, we need to let them know the consequences of that action. So here we have a modal making sure they understand that. And in this case, we're giving them additional friction where they have to provide a reason for the cancellation and then hit the button to make sure they understand the consequences. So how do we evaluate good UI? Here are some of the best UI practices we follow. Consistency and standards means making sure your designs use the same components throughout. Hierarchy will guide the eye to the most important elements on the page. White space means giving your content room to breathe. Accessibility means making sure everyone can use your site, including people with visual impairments, disabilities, and low tech savviness. Responsiveness refers to making sure your website works on multiple screen sizes like tablets and phones. And typography and colors refers to making sure you are communicating the correct message behind your organization. So specific fonts might be more friendly than others. Colors might have meaning like red or blue or green. And here are just a few examples of those best practices. For consistency and standards, you don't want to use inconsistent components throughout your site. So for example, inconsistent buttons might confuse users about where to click, what is a button, and what is text. Instead, you should use standardized buttons with a design system throughout so that there's no guessing. For hierarchy, clear visual hierarchy guides the eye to the most important elements. In this example, we designed headers, subheaders, and accordions to house and prioritize information throughout the website to help people find information. And lastly, give your content room to breathe. In this example, we gave lots of white space or red space to the main CTA, so choosing your state. It provides visual impact and makes it easy for the user to take the first step. in a process that might otherwise feel overwhelming?
Yeah, so then we can talk a little bit about how research pertains to these UI and UX decisions that we're making, and more importantly, kind of problems that we see if we're not including research in those things. So we tend to see some common issues if research is not included in the design process and the development process of a product. So these are some of the most common ones that we see. Firstly, usability. So this means a user might not know how to use the product. And if you're not testing that a user can actively complete a task or get through a flow from A to B, then you won't necessarily know where those friction points are, and then the users will have issues using the site. We also see issues with feature fit. So if you're not necessarily designing the right thing for users, their pain points won't be met. And so then that kind of ties into the third option, which is retention. So if you haven't built the right features for users, they are not going to be likely to return to the website. So you'll be losing those users as a result of having the incorrect product. And then finally, kind of the most important thing is, or the most unfortunate thing is rebuilding. So if you've built the wrong thing the first time around because you haven't considered the user's pain points, the usability of the website, then you'll end up having to spend time rebuilding something and essentially trying again after you've built the wrong thing the first time. And so we also just like to think of research as kind of creating a clear path through the design process and development process of a product, which otherwise can have a lot of these distractions. So if you've been in meetings with people and everybody has their own opinions about what something should look like or what features should be included, maybe you've heard sentences like, well, this stakeholder wants this particular thing, or we think that the users want this, or we think the users are these people. Those kind of things can divert you from sort of the alignment of our users actually need this XYZ, so we're going to build this solution. So it just sort of keeps you anchored to one sort of centralized thing that everybody can agree upon because it's based in real truth of what your users are needing. So now we'll start to talk about what research can look like and some of the different techniques that we can use. There are a ton of different ways to conduct research, so this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but just for today's purposes, we'll kind of focus on these 5 types. So user interviews, surveys, A/B tests, usability studies, and analytics. And we'll get into these a little bit more and kind of what defines each one and what makes them different. Okay, so as we start to think about differences in research, there are a couple factors that we can kind of think about as we're maybe selecting that research, or kind of figuring out what kinds of data we're looking for when we're trying to do research. So something you probably have heard of before is qualitative versus quantitative data. And how this relates to research is really kind of the number of people that you're going to be talking to and how in-depth you'll get with each person. So qualitative data, you're probably going to be speaking to a smaller set of users, but you're going to really be talking to them in depth about how they feel about the product, how they're using the product, etc. Versus quantitative, you're probably going to be talking to or just reaching out to a lot more users, and you're just kind of getting little bits and pieces of information from each one. And then we also kind of have to think about attitudinal versus behavioral data. And so the difference between these things is attitudinal is much more, this is what the user thinks about it. They like the site, they like the design, they feel that it's helpful to them, just sort of like their thoughts and their feelings about something and their sentiment. Versus behavioral data is much more, this is what I'm doing on the website. I'm clicking this button, I'm going to this page. I'm actually taking these actions here and there. And so it's kind of what people say versus what they do, and what becomes more important when you're choosing your research method. So if we take each of those 4 factors and we kind of plot them out, along with all of the research methods that we've talked about before, you can start to see how each one will give you kind of a different type of data as you've completed it. So like all the way in the bottom left corner, user interviews are going to be really qualitative. You're going to be in depth with a few people, and it's going to be really based on their thoughts and feelings. Whereas like usability studies, you're still going to be speaking to a few people, and kind of getting like in depth with them, but it's going to be much more based around, here's what I'm clicking and here's where I'm going to do these things. So it's much more behavioral. Then you've got your analytics and your A/B tests, which are going to be quantitative because you're just going to be kind of looking across a bunch more users, and it's still kind of focused around what action they're taking, what they're more drawn to do. And then surveys are quantitative because you're sending it out to a ton of people, but you're really not capturing actions, you're just capturing thoughts and feelings at the moment.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about our most common methods here at Theory and Principle for user research. Probably the most common thing we do is user interviews. So user interviews are qualitative research sessions. They involve direct conversations with users to understand their needs, preferences, and pain points. We typically would do this like at the beginning of a project in order to gain insights into the users, and then from there generate themes so that we can start sketching out flows and address those needs and pain points in design. Next, we do a lot of usability testing. So usability testing is evaluating a product by having users perform tasks and observing the interactions and collecting feedback. So this is often done once a product has been designed. It doesn't have to be fully designed. It can be still wireframes or a prototype, but it can also be done on the final product. And this type of testing ensures user friendliness as well as making sure the product aligns with the audience needs. The third type of most common method we use is analytics. So analytics tools let us know how users are getting to our site, how long they're staying, and what and where, when and where they might be leaving. They won't necessarily tell us the why, but the analytics are helpful to pinpoint the problem areas within a website or flow.
So you might be thinking, how do I choose the right method at this moment? And so the answer is it depends. And we have several different factors that we are going to look at. I'll get into each of these. But really depending on the stage of your product, the time that you have, the type of data you're looking for, the research stimulus that you can use for people to react to, as well as the output, are all going to potentially determine which direction you'll go in the type of research you select. So first we'll talk about stage of product. And so kind of chunked it up here into 3 different stages. Early being you just have an idea or a concept of a product. So you really haven't designed anything, you're super early on, but you can still definitely do research at this stage. Or you might be a little bit further along. So maybe you have some wireframes, mock-ups. It could still be kind of at a sketch mode or a prototype, but you've started making some decisions, and you're still trying to validate some things. Or you could be kind of late stage, and that's more so that you already have a live product, you already have users, so something's already out in the market and you're just trying to sort of improve upon what's already been built. In terms of time needed, we understand that with budgets and deadlines, sometimes you only have a couple days to get something done, and you can do research in that time. It might limit the kinds of research you can do, but we definitely like to advocate that you don't have to have a ton of time to get research done. So we always try to advocate for some bit of research, even if it's a really small study. More typically, we'll do studies that are maybe a week or a few weeks, because a lot of times this is user interviews or usability tests. So we just need that little bit more time to recruit participants, do our interviews, gather the data, and then create reports. And then it's pretty unlikely, pretty rare that we'll do anything that's a month or more. But that's really if you're willing to spend that time because you just want to get those super, super in-depth insights about your users. So you could spend really as much time as you wanted. But then also, of course, along with more time, it's going to be more money. So those two things are always tied together. So if you're just wanting to spend a little bit, analytics is a great low cost option. So you just add the code snippet one time, and then you can start gathering data into your live website. In that middle tier where we're spending maybe a week or two, that could be something like A/B tests, user interviews, usability studies, and those, because they're just taking a little bit more time, they'll be a little bit more expensive. And then for that third bucket where you're spending a ton of time, that really only pertains to like a diary study, which would be where users are kind of actually keeping a diary of how they're using a product day in, day out. But you really have to get to quite a large study to get to a huge budget like that. And then we'll think about type of data. So this kind of relates back to what I was speaking about before. So are you looking for in-depth insights about users, or do you want more general pictures of all of your users? Do you care more about statistics and figures? Do you care about quotes? Do you want to know how people feel, or do you want to know what they're actually doing? So those kinds of things can also help you determine what kind of research you'll be looking for. And then kind of importantly to planning out any sort of test is figuring out what are we actually going to use to test. So if you're early stage, it can be nothing. You can do an interview, talk to users without showing them anything, just gathering their feelings, talking about issues that they're having, how they might need to solve their problem. But you can, of course, always test with wireframes, any sort of mock-up or prototype. If you're trying to get more reactions from people and see how they're feeling about what you've already decided on. And then you can test a live product as well if you're looking to kind of have more of a real exercise for people to do. If you're trying to test a particular flow, or see if people can complete certain tasks, a live product is really nice to just kind of get into those more detailed kind of findings. And then based on the data that you've captured, and based on the type of research that you've selected, the data can be turned into a ton of different types of outputs. So sometimes you might want to turn data into documentation or diagrams of user behavior. So this could be a user journey map, a persona, information architecture, or just a user flow. So if you're kind of early on and you just need a visualization of that data, that could be a good option. Maybe if you're doing something more like a usability test, you care more about reports about task success, how much time people are spending on tasks, things that are a bit more statistically driven. And then if you're, maybe just super focused on the numbers and how many people are using this and how long are they staying, you can kind of dive into usage metrics from analytics. So it's really kind of all kind of relating back to that qualitative versus quantitative question. And then, so I've charted out here all 5 of the different types of research methods that we started this section with, and then kind of outlined how each one falls within the 5 factors we just discussed. And so you can kind of start to see here, if you have a particular factor that is, let's say I've got a few days to complete a research test, that's going to then kind of filter down the things that you can do. So maybe I'm just doing analytics, or maybe I'm just doing a survey. But if I really want to generate a usability report, then I'm going to want to do usability studies. So it's kind of a mix and match of what priorities are most important to you, as well as where are you at within your product cycle.
And so if you are doing user interviews or a usability study, you need to recruit users. And we recommend doing this as soon as possible. And we have a few tips that will make it worth their time. It's really important to provide payment or some type of monetary payment to users to understand that their time is valuable. So we commonly do this with gift cards, and we work with our clients to provide those to the users. It's important to limit the duration. Nobody's going to want to spend 2 hours doing a user test. So be realistic about the amount of time users have and schedule the smallest amount of time you think you will need. And lastly, to take the stress off and make sure you're getting good feedback, you need to let your users know that you want any and all of their opinions about the product. When users are comfortable sharing their opinion, they will give you the best insights. So you want to make sure they're not just saying, yes, it's great, in order to get through it. You want to get their real feedback and let them know that that's okay if it's bad.
Yeah, and once you've completed your research and you've gathered some data, you might be thinking, now how do I analyze this and make sense of it? So we'll look at a couple examples. First, we'll look at qualitative. So what we're looking at here is basically a grid of sticky notes in a bunch of different colors. And so in this case, let's say I've completed several user interviews, and each color sticky note indicates a different user that I interviewed. So I have all of these different things that I've jotted down, thoughts, feelings, issues that the person mentioned, just anything that I pulled out that I felt was important. And then as I start to think about all of these different pieces, something that we commonly do is called affinity mapping. So when you have things in these little Post-it notes, you can just sort of organize them around. So basically, if you think of common themes, if you've seen people are saying they're having issues with the same screen, or they have the same kind of like issue using a particular feature, or maybe they both desire the same new feature that doesn't already exist. Any of those things where you're seeing people saying the same thing or kind of having the same issues, you can group them together. And you can also see on the left here, there's another example that was done in a spreadsheet. So you can kind of do the same thing using cells in a spreadsheet and organize the cells by a particular thought and then group them together in that way as well. And then that's where you start to really see the themes of your research. So what becomes the most important? What are the biggest problems people are facing? And a nice thing about doing it in this way, where each piece of information is kind of the same size, is as you're grouping things together, you can see literally what is the biggest theme. So what's coming up the most for people versus maybe something that you thought was really important and one person mentioned it or it didn't come up at all. So being able to kind of visualize the topics that came out of your research in this way can be really helpful for you to then prioritize what can we fix first, what can we put on the back burner for later. And sometimes doing things like this will also spur more research. So you might get a theme that comes up that makes you think, oh, I need to actually talk to people a bit more about this. So it can kind of be cyclical in that way as well.
Okay, so now let's look at a quantitative example. So, and it's important to analyze the traffic that comes to your website. So from something like Google Analytics, you can see how many users are coming to your site. You might be able to tell from where they're coming. You can see the average session duration, so how long they're staying. On average, 2 to 4 minutes is good, so this is not so great. You can see the bounce rate. So this is the percentage of visitors who navigate away from your site after only visiting one page. 40 to 60% is good. Above that is not so great. So if your website does have the high bounce rate, what can you do? You might want to think about the content on your landing page and go back to our UX and UI best practices. So is the page overwhelming? Is there enough white space? Is there clear hierarchy? And can users find what they're looking for? Another thing you might analyze is something like a form or a user path on your website. This is one that we have on one of the websites that we designed, where we can see there's a starting point and the form goes through a number of steps, step 1, step 2, step 3, up to step 7. And in this example, you can see the numbers. They didn't go down drastically from each step, so that's good. That means that nobody's kind of falling off at a specific place. But if they were to, the numbers were to drop between step 3 and step 4, that would be a good indicator to go back and look at step 3 and find out why people are leaving the site here. You might want to analyze the content and design of that page. Like, is it clear what you're asking the user to do in step 3? Are the options clearly visible? Are the buttons and components consistent? And go through some of the best practices on that step as well. Okay, now we're going to get into some case studies. So this is where we're going to talk about some products that we've designed and how we have implemented user feedback and user research. So the first example is a client called Justicia Lab. We helped our client design a platform to support immigrant clients, their advocates, and the general public through their legal experience. So basically, people could come to this website, fill out a form, and if they might qualify for some type of visa status, for example, DACA or TPS and DED, they could create an account and be connected with an organization. The organization would also have a portal where they could assign advocates to these clients. So we worked with Justicia Lab to design this product for nonprofits. We did research with them in the middle stage of the design. So we were testing on wireframe prototypes. We did user interviews and also usability testing, which was qualitative. Our research goals were to discover the pain points and goals for the advocates and organization administrators working in the space. We wanted to know if the product was intuitive, if it was easy to use, and was it clear where to find information. But we also wanted to know which features were the most valuable. We didn't have the budget to design everything and build everything, so we wanted to discover which features were the most valuable to the advocates and admins at these organizations. So for this process, we designed a wireframe prototype. We recruited and scheduled interviews. We created a user interview script and interviewed 7 people, both advocates and nonprofit org admins. We analyzed the feedback and implemented changes as needed. So here is an example of the wireframe that we designed. It was a clickable prototype that we walked through with the advocates. And this was a feature that we designed called Marketplace. Because not all organizations might have the capacity to help people of a certain language and visa type, they had this idea of a marketplace where different organizations could come in and pick up clients that might be a good fit for them. And when we tested this with the advocates, people liked the plain language description, and they liked the idea that orgs might be able to pick up clients that they don't have the capacity for. But then some of the negative feedback or concerns were that the name Marketplace evoked images of purchasing people. Some people worried, if people could sit unserved here for a long time, when would they be represented? And then it was also unclear to some people how people came to be on this list. And here's another image from the wireframe where if you clicked on a client, you could see more information about them and add the client to your organization. And what we heard from the advocates was the problem isn't a lack of clients, it's the capacity to serve clients. So maybe we were trying to solve the wrong problem. it is still a problem, but maybe not the right problem to solve at this time. So how did we implement the feedback? In this case, we didn't end up designing the marketplace feature. It didn't make it into the MVP designs, but we did have more space to explore other concepts. We explored things like messaging, creating appointments, status updates, being able to fill out forms and complete tasks, because these were kind of the features that advocates told us were the most valuable in the prototype that we showed to them.
Another project that we have worked on in the past is Legal Tune-Up. So this is a project based out of Wisconsin with an organization that was really hoping to remove legal barriers for people to be able to pull in their public records and see if there were any items that could be removed, and then to help those people to automate the removal of any sort of like issues on their record without having to have a lawyer present. So this was also done in middle stage. So we had actually kind of some development going on. So we had a little bit of an in-progress application where we were kind of live building some things, but then we were testing on the live, and we did user interviews, usability testing, and then A/B testing. So kind of a mix throughout this project. And what we were really hoping to find was if users understood the core function of the website. So do they notice different calls to action on different pages? Does the process of using the application make sense to them? So is there a confusing point in the workflow, or is there another way they might expect things to work and get to viewing their record? And then we also just wanted to know if they were able to complete the tasks. So how easy was it to use the application, input their information, complete a removal process, and things like that. So because we were working with an in-progress application, we started by kind of releasing the latest development version of the app. And then as we were kind of planning our recruiting and scheduling of interviews, we created our script. We ended up interviewing 7 people as well for this project. And then after our interviews, we analyzed that feedback and implemented the changes. So this is an example of kind of a usability test / user interview that we did. So these are some wireframes that we designed based on, if you can see in the center bottom of the screen with the pink outline, this is what that information looked like prior on the website. So a little bit hard to kind of distinguish what the information was that you were looking at. So we wanted to go ahead and kind of redesign it, make it a little bit more clear for people. And a special point for this test is that in the wireframes that we designed, we actually used real data from the users that we tested with. And that was actually a nice kind of addition, which allowed us to make things more contextual for people, and it allowed them to give us more accurate feedback around the language and understanding specific events that they were looking at, like speeding or traffic violation. So it helped us to kind of prioritize what we could show users, as well as how we could present their driving record with context that made sense to them. And so people really liked being able to see the active violations, which you can see in kind of the third wireframe. They felt like it was clear, and they had an ability to see their full record, which they felt like was really nice. And based on what existed prior, it was not something they had really been able to view before. And overall, they liked the detail. They felt like the prior version was more confusing, so this was like a nice refresh for them. But then some concerns were that in that middle wireframe, the $248, they weren't necessarily sure what that covers, if it's other violations or if it's just one speeding ticket. And then there were also just some confusion around certain language around when I need to pay fines, if I'm waiting for suspension. So really, these were kind of more straightforward updates of just kind of focusing copy and organizing the content a little bit differently. This is another screenshot from a different test we run. And that was focused on kind of going through the actual experience of entering your information and then viewing the results after you've pulled your personal record. So this is a screen that we showed users that would be like your results. You've entered all your information and this is what the system has pulled back for you. So it tells you steps that you can take in the future, your forms, kind of your dashboard once you've created your account. And so people felt like this was pretty straightforward for them. And that up until this point in the process, they felt like it was kind of a comfortable user experience. They felt okay going through these steps without having an attorney. But we had some concerns around needing more confirmation. So if an action has been completed, they weren't necessarily sure that they had successfully done something, or if it was in some other form of pending state. So that visibility of system status was not fully being met. And then they also wanted more direction around next steps. So just having a clearer sort of direction of action items. So this is a second iteration to that design. So some updates that we made were kind of taking it out of that sort of dashboard layout and making it a single column. So having everything feel a little bit more clear and streamlined. We added some more action buttons just to kind of indicate what things are more easily able to be focused on at the time, as well as more labels for things that could be removable. So just giving people more of those status indicators of where certain tasks are at, what's removable, what are things that you need to take action on, and then, also using different types of buttons to indicate less important actions like the create account. And then a third example from this project was an A/B test. So these are two different options of the landing page that we had designed. And we showed both to a set of users to kind of feel out what their sentiment was about each one and if there was a preference for one or the other. And so kind of some of the things that came out of this were overwhelmingly A was more positively seen, and a lot of times it was tied to the how it works section at the bottom. So giving people more concrete information about how this actually works and what they can expect from the application and website. There was also some indication that for landing page B, the section that had logos at the bottom was not as relevant to people. They weren't really sure that it resonated. And then I think also just having a different illustration at the top. So having people on landing page A versus a phone screen on B felt a little bit more personal to them. So we ended up going with landing page A because of all of those reasons and just like having a better resonancy with our users.
So the third case study we're going to talk about is called Betzetic. We helped Betzetic, an LA-based community justice organization, to design a web app that allows 24/7 access to information-rich resources for people in a variety of life situations and a new pathway to get help directly. So this was specifically around their self-help conservatorship clinic, so helping people navigate the various steps within supporting someone else or supporting themselves. And this was the homepage here on the right. For them, we did user interviews and analytics testing. And this was done at a late stage after development with a live product. We wanted to know what the bugs and pain points were, U-turns, and areas of confusion. So also usability testing. And we also wanted to see how users were completing common tasks like questionnaires, getting support, and viewing the learning pages. And we also wanted to know how long users were on the site and where they might be falling off. So we released the latest version with Google Analytics. We scheduled interviews, we created a script and interviewed 6 people. We analyzed the feedback and implemented the changes as needed. So with the user interviews specifically, the feedback we received was both positive and raised some questions. Overall, people liked the simplicity of the homepage and felt comfortable getting started, but all conservator users interviewed expressed discomfort at attempting the conservatorship process on their own. So that would be learning more and doing it themselves. And we also found that sometimes the language was confusing. Most people were coming to the site and supporting someone else, is what we found based on the analytics. So clicking support someone else would take you to the getting started page. This is the getting started page, and it was the second most viewed page on the website. And this page was designed so that users would come here and learn more about conservatorship, and then they would register, and then as returning users, they could come back and check in at their step. But what we found through the analytics was that people were actually, after coming here, they were registering with the clinic. That's what people wanted to do, because through the interviews, we also found people weren't comfortable doing this on their own and just learning. So this was kind of the most common action. So, and the hierarchy on this page was lacking. So how can we implement that feedback? One way to do that would be to add more hierarchy and really kind of emphasize registering with the clinic. We could make that the first box within the page. We could use the primary action for the questionnaire button, and we could update the language so that it's more clear that this is registering with the clinic. We could go even further and add even more hierarchy. So we could make the register with the clinic the full width of the page, make the text bigger and the icon bigger, and the button stands out as being that primary action color instead of secondary. If we wanted to emphasize it even more, this would be a great option to go with. And this is our last case study.
Yes. Yeah, we'll finish out with Legal Aid at Work. So this is a project that was based in California, and the organization supported workers specifically in employment-related situations. If they were having questions or issues, this website was really a tool for them to get access to resources and contact information for relevant issues that they might be facing. So this project was developed, and then we did some research at the end. So we were kind of open to the idea that maybe there might be some things that were not fully correct based on testing all the way at the end, but we did some user interviews and some usability testing just to kind of get a lay of the land of how the application was coming across to users. So we were looking at what were the friction points, or were there any areas where people were getting stuck or unable to complete the flow? We also were interested in kind of analyzing if the language and iconography was clear, specifically because we were kind of focusing on non-English speaking users or users with low literacy or non-specialized language. And then did the presentation of the results make users feel comfortable when they were dealing with their legal issues? So based on this, we prepared a test plan following the app being deployed and available to users. We recruited and scheduled. We talked to 7 people total, 6 in English and 1 in Spanish. And then from that feedback, we were able to implement changes. And so this is a page that a user would see after entering in a particular issue that they were facing based on their employment. So this results page would give them a list of resources that they could access that might be relevant to them. And we found that people really liked that everything felt very California focused and specific. And then they liked that in the header of this page, there's also a section that would indicate what they selected. So they didn't have to remember how they got here or what they selected that gave them all of these results. But then there was kind of an issue around the results, like the fact sheets that you see in the bulk of the page. Those would open into a new tab. So a couple people had an issue of opening the new tab and then getting back here. So that could actually be as easy as just not opening things in a new tab and letting people use the back arrow in the browser, which can sometimes be more familiar to people in terms of navigating. And as we were going through the flow of the application, we also had some feedback around some kind of illustration and iconography on the website. So the before illustration you can see had a group of people. So we were trying to indicate diversity. But what actually people gave us feedback on was that they felt like it indicated the site was intended for individuals who had disabilities. So it wasn't really indicating exactly what we wanted. And we ended up updating it so that the people were a little bit more kind of employment focused, and it looked like they were indicating different jobs. And we also had some feedback around an icon. So sometimes user feedback can be on really small things, and particularly with icons when they're indicating really abstract concepts, it can take some iteration. So in this case, this circle with an exclamation point was being used to indicate losing or quitting my job. And several people were saying that it was just kind of vague to them, which is fair because it's such an abstract concept, and trying to indicate that through a really small icon on a screen can sometimes just be really unclear. So we ended up suggesting a few different alternatives to them, incorporating the kind of illustration of a little person and an arrow leaving. So just kind of leaving it up to them to just sort of maybe change that over and have a few different options. And then since we were doing some user interviews, we were also able to just pull out some quotes from people. And sometimes this is just a really nice way to kind of share with stakeholders and the client that it's been, how users are feeling about the product when they've looked at it. So we had several really positive quotes out of these user interviews, like it was very easy to use. I can't wait to use it. This would have been a good place for me to start. So in terms of like qualitative data, this can just be a really nice way to sort of get a feel for whether you're actually meeting what the users are needing.
Yeah. And so that brings us to the end of our case studies and our presentation. Have time for some questions if anyone wants to bring any up.
Yeah, it looks like Sarah just posted one. So do you have any tips for handling user feedback that could be contradictory, especially if you're working with a small number of users? Definitely, that does happen. I think you then have to either, it's always better to, try to talk to a couple more people if you can. But then you kind of have to evaluate what each person is saying and what they're wanting. So if they're asking for two different features, let's say, and one is a lot bigger to build than the other, those are kind of some things that you can weigh different perspectives. Or if you build version A versus version B, is one going to be kind of riskier to build? Like, is it going to
So I'm not sure.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, okay. Is something going to be kind of more of a risk if you build one version versus another? Yeah, Rose, do you have any other thoughts around that question?
Yeah, I think that's definitely come up, and we do try to talk to more users when possible, but also we do go back to those UX best practices to decide whether something makes sense to design it a certain way versus another. And also, as you mentioned, like understand maybe like the feelings that might be behind a comment about how to change something versus, watching their actions and how those two differentiate from each other.
Happy to answer any other questions. Or if you want us to go over something again that didn't make sense the first time.
It's really interesting that even 6 and 7 people surveyed could provide valuable enough feedback that could help shape the project.
Yeah, I think what we find is that once you start to get over, like 10 users for user interviews, you start to hear if you're interviewing like the same type of user, you start to hear the same thing. So that's really kind of, I guess, our sweet spot here at Theory and Principle. We typically do like 5 to 10 interviews if we're doing user interviews per user group.
Could you give me a little bit more information on kind of what goes into designing those user groups, how you choose like what kinds of questions to ask, those sorts of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's something that could also end up being a research study in of itself, or sometimes we'll do workshops as well to kind of define personas. Because sometimes people really understand, like I have like an admin user and a like front-facing user, and that's it. But it's kind of defining like what are all of the things that people need to be able to do. And then do those fall into particular categories? A lot of times too, we find, I think, that the roles of these personas kind of align to like real life people. So maybe if you're designing a tool for your organization and you have somebody who is kind of an admin, a lot of times we will kind of shape things around people's positions and kind of what makes sense for like your organizational structure. So that's super common, but it can be really as many or as few as makes sense to you. But it's definitely unique to every single product.
Yeah, and I think a lot of our projects typically have like the public user coming to the public facing site, but then we also have like the lawyer user or the nonprofit or the advocate also coming in, and they have their own portal. So we have specific experiences designed around each user type, but there certainly could be more of a breakdown between the public user and their needs.
Any other questions? Any last thoughts? Anything from anybody?
I do have one question about kind of balancing, I guess, stakeholder priorities versus the actual user experience. Have you ever had to kind of contend with those two differing needs? And how do you explain, I guess, to stakeholders that, you know, maybe what they're asking for isn't going to be the best solution for the users?
Yeah, I would say often stakeholders want to say that they know their users and we don't need to talk to them. And that's always kind of a red flag. And it's always best to talk to the end user and listen to what they have to say, because it might be really different than what the stakeholder understands or wants to build. And it doesn't really make sense to build something that might not be what the client, what the public user is looking for. So yeah, I think that is something that we run into quite often. I don't know, Emily, if you have any like suggestions of how how we convince stakeholders to listen to the users.
Yeah, I mean, that's sometimes that is like the beauty of research of like, because it's not just like my opinion versus your opinion. If you're the stakeholder, it's if I have data from a user that I can say like, well, we've spoken to this person and they both feel this way, or they feel these two different ways. I feel like that is generally pretty powerful versus not having any at all. But I think that's also just part of the product process, is constantly battling these different opinions of a project, and kind of having to decide and make decisions that are maybe going to have consequences one way or another.
Thank you.
We're at time. Wanted to say thanks to everybody for joining today. Had a blast talking with you guys today about research and product process and design. Really appreciate everybody.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out if you want to discuss anything further or have any questions. I have our emails here at the end and our website for Theory and Principle. Feel free to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much.